are some of the things that we can look out for? How from age 2 to age 15, what are some of the signs?
The problem with autism, it's such a wide
Wide
spectrum,
spectrum.
right? You have things like sensory issues, and sensory issues could vary from any one of the senses. Taste, touch, smell, visual, hearing, right? So it could be, and the hearing and all the senses could be different, right? I mean, I've heard of children that, I mean, sometimes the sound of a ringing bell is sound like you are actually inside the bell and this thing is ringing almost on your ears and the bell could be far away, right? Those kind of things. Visual, some children, certain colors trip them off, right? Like they wake up and they see a color before they see a certain color. It could be a bad day for them, right? It could be a bad hour, right? Taste is a lot of issues a lot of parents have with children with autism, because especially when it comes with food, right? And then you may have the color with food. So certain food colors, they're not going to touch once it's that color. Yeah, right. And then you have the texture issue, right? Both taste and feel, right? I mean, some children smell as well. I mean, you have things like clothing. I'm glad my daughter doesn't have that issue, but some children, certain types of material, just feel like sandpaper on them.
The thing with, I try to explain to a lot of people who don't know or don't understand. Think of if you've ever had an episode of dizziness, and think of how you felt really, really out of it. That is what they go through on a daily basis. Anything can throw their senses off. So if they're hypersensitive to sound, as Ron rightly said, just that can just throw them off. And what happens is the meltdown or the stimming behavior is an attempt to right themselves again, just like you would hold on to right yourself. It's an attempt to right themselves again, and that's why things like a ball, sitting on a ball, or walking with a heavy backpack upstairs, or a weighted blanket or weighted vest. Those things help to center them and to ground them again and to keep them focused, because it's like their senses are off all the time. And for you just to be dizzy for 10 minutes, it's really, really confusing and disheartening. But for them, this is their world.
Yeah, just kind of adding on to what Deborah was saying. I mean, the room that we're in, the bright lights, the hum of the air condition, the small sound of music in the distance, this is not bothering us. We're operating typically. We're having a conversation. We're continuing. But for somebody with autism, that overwhelming sense could just lead to a meltdown. And again, one of the key areas is social communication. So, an inability to communicate your feelings. Think about if you go to a foreign country, for instance, you don't speak the language, nobody's attempting to speak English, and you're trying to figure something out. You're lost, you are hungry, you need to use the bathroom. How are you communicating that without being able to verbalize it? Is somebody picking up on the non-verbal cues? So these are just some factors to be aware of, especially when meeting somebody with autism, just how they can interpret you and what can you, as the typically developed person, do in return to break down the communication barrier. What can you do to meet them, not just for them to meet us in the sort of society that we live in, for instance? I'm still not really sure in terms of the younger age, as a parent. I know you said that, sometimes it's a gut feeling, but then that's dependent on the parent and how self-aware the parent is, Self-awareness is a hard thing, there are mothers on the news that still defend their son after they're going into jail because they're just so far away from being honest with themselves and being able to do that introspection. Is there advice, if you were as Deborah, I'm sure you've had situations where you, or Ron, where you see behavior at 2 and 3 years old and you guys could say, this kid needs to get checked out, So what would that look like? What would it look like if you're at a play date and
you're seeing something, and because I know, I mean, I test in something called self-smart. I do a lot of introspection, but the average human being is the hardest thing for someone to do.
Yes.
You know, to look at my child and say maybe they're autistic.
Yeah.
Some people can't even admit that they have any kind of learning disability. They're not reading fast enough, you know?
Yeah.
What would you suggest? Some very basic things that a parent out there looking on can look for to say, maybe we should go get tested.
Well, I know
Go ahead.
Megan is going to add on to this, but from a communication point of view, so one of the things that happens, and I think Ron touched on this, was that their vocabulary, they actually lose words. So they either stop speaking altogether. I know Rowan went down to like about 4 or 5 words. And the stimming behavior and the lining up of things. So you would find that a child with autism would probably line these cups up in a particular order, lining up toys in a particular order. Those are the kinds of behaviors that you would see.
Yeah, excellent examples. I mean, what I would say is your child hitting typical milestones? You know, are they walking out the streets in age? Are they talking? Is there that joint attention? That's one of the first things you look for with a baby. You know, if you're interacting with a baby and they are looking at what you're doing and you point at something, do they follow your gaze to look at, see where you're pointed? Or is it that's just completely blank because they're not exactly clued into what you're saying? Is it sensory issues, just as Ron had mentioned, you know, are they fussy eaters? Do they walk on their toes? You know, do loud noises scare them? Now, keep in mind, as I said, it is a spectrum. It's not for all kids. If your child has one of these sort of developmental differences, it does not mean they're on the spectrum. I would always recommend go to a developmental pediatrician. We have a couple of speech and language therapists who are trained in ADOS and can test as well. So I would say get more than one opinion if you're unsure. But some of these are what we'd call red flags for young kids. Sort of by 18 months to 2 years would be when you start really seeing a lot of differences in development.
So we're going to go on a break and then